Welcome from the Office for Education Policy. I'm Denise Arola. I'm the Associate Director, and I'm here to kick off a series of videos on frequently asked questions. These can be questions about assessment, accountability, whatever it may be. This one happens to be about both assessment and accountability, and this is such a common question that I'm going to address it in two parts to do service to it, but try to keep these short. We are frequently asked about how to set a growth goal with students and what is the scaled score that my student needs to make to meet adequate growth for this coming year. And that's a very difficult question because there are different ways that we talk about growth. So let's talk about the two ways that at least I talk about growth: year to year and within year. The year-to-year growth is usually the spring summative to the spring summative because that's the end of the year when students have completed their learning for that grade level. It takes at least 2 data points, but it can usually use more data points. It's value-added growth that's used in accountability and teacher merit pay. It really answers the question, how are students growing in achievement this year compared to how much we think they'll grow based on how they've done in the past? That is one particular type of growth that I get asked about a lot. The other is within year growth. And this could be interim to summative or interim to summative. It usually has at least 2 data points or more. And it's used to understand how students' learning is progressing toward end of the year grade level expectations. So we're going to break this down. I think it's super important to recognize that growth and achievement can take very different forms, and it requires at least 2 data points. But before we even get into that, let's talk about what does growth actually mean? I mean, we talk about a change in achievement over time, but in large-scale assessment, it could be getting more items correct on the next assessment. It could be getting more difficult items correct on the next assessment. It could be getting similar numbers of items correct, but of a higher difficulty level. I mean, you can see that these are numerous ways that we could define growth. Because we can define growth in many different ways, we want to make sure that we take into consideration the design considerations of the assessment system that we're using for measuring growth. So ATLAS, when it was introduced in 2024, represented a new theory of action and a subsequent design. Prior to ATLAS, we were working with ACT Aspire, and the theory of action had to do with college and career readiness and whether or not students were on a trajectory to college and career readiness. ATLAS is different. The purpose is to understand how students are performing relative to grade level expectations. This was something that everybody wanted in the feedback sessions that were done to figure out the next system for Arkansas. What the other part of ATLAS is, it was designed to provide additional tools to support learning throughout the year, but aligned within the system. So aligned to the same standards that individuals are being judged on at the end of the year. It was also designed to have different roles for those different parts of the system. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into it. It is standards-based. It has a within grade scale, which means that year-to-year scores are on the same scale despite grade level or test taking. So that proficiency anchor is 1,060 no matter what grade or subject. And the lowest scale score is 1,000, and the highest scale score, I think, is 1,120 possible. And grades 3 through high school interims, and even the K2 interims, are mini summatives, so they're built on the same blueprint as the summative assessment itself. And these design considerations are really important in how you use the data to determine growth in achievement and progress over time. So we want to be coherent in the purpose and use of these scores. And when we have all of the systems aligned in purpose and used as they're intended to be used, then that gives us a coherent system that sends a strong and steady signal. If they're used in ways that they're not intended to be used, we get some incoherence, and that can really cross our signals and send us down rabbit holes that we may not need to go down. Here in Arkansas, we use a value-added model for year-to-year growth, and we do that for a couple of different reasons. We want to be able to have something that's fair, and we want to be able to measure achievement over time. And it's important to use something that is stable and able to handle variation over time for higher stakes purposes. So our value-added model is used in accountability, it's used in teacher merit pay, it's used in a variety of different ways to look at how the system is doing at this more global level. So when we consider what we know about what influences student achievement, we want to make sure that what we're using for high stakes purposes takes into account what happens to a student before they get to you. We don't have control as classroom teachers over whether or not students had the same opportunity to learn in their past, whether or not the student actually engaged in and demonstrated learning in their past. And there are just so many other factors that are related to the student that can explain their achievement. So we want to make sure we're using year-to-year growth for these higher stakes purposes that is valid for these purposes and reliable over time. One of the reasons we do that is because our model recognizes that students, because of the different factors that influence students' growth and achievement prior to them coming to you in your classroom, is that these factors can result in students starting in different places and growing at different rates. We already have a measure. Our standards-based Atlas score tells us about how students are doing relative to grade level expectations. That's one way to look at student learning. But if we want to look at change in student learning and we want to be fair about it, we need to recognize these factors. Like on the left-hand side, you can see that these students are starting, their initial scores are at different places. On the right-hand side, the figure shows that these different students are growing at different rates. And we have a value-added model that responds to both of those. So this becomes important because we have a within grade scale. So if you were to just look at achievement within grade from year to year, it's going to be hard to judge year-to-year growth in achievement the same way we can do with a value-added model. So you can see that it's pretty flat, but then also there's little interesting things that happen, like in math, from algebra to geometry, we have this drop from 8th grade math down to slightly lower algebra and geometry scores. So we want to take all the design considerations and the considerations that are part of how has our population done in the past, and how does the population do this year, and that helps inform the growth scores for students. All right, I know there is an elephant in the room, and that elephant is everybody wants to know exactly what a student is predicted to score in this school year so that they can shoot for that as a target. Now, I would love to be able to give you a specific number, but it's more complex than that. So let's talk a little bit about that. The reason you don't get that score at the beginning of the year is because we're using prior achievement to control for what's happened in the student's past. And then we're using the current year to control for how are all students doing, and is this a realistic score for a student at this spot, starting at different places? Is this realistic for students to achieve? So there's a trade-off here, there's a tension. We're maximizing fairness to control for prior achievement. We're using Z-scores to include as much prior data as possible because we're connecting to prior ACT Aspire scores as well as prior Atlas scores. And also because of our within grade scale, we need to use Z-scores to talk about year-to-year progress. We do not have a vertical scale that helps us see that. And this is really important because it isn't about who you get in your class, it's about what they learn while they're in your classroom. Why this is important is because we know that achievement is correlated. It's a negative 0.3 relationship. at the student level. And then at the school level, it's a negative 0.6. So our achievement scores are already part of the accountability system, and they are already correlated with factors that you don't control as a school or a teacher. On the other hand, value-added growth has a negative 0.07, which is basically zero correlation with things like economic disadvantage status. And then at the school level, it's been calculated at a negative 0.19. So what that means is it doesn't have a student level association with what happened to the student before and any of the risk factors before. And then at the school level, there's a slight one, but it's because of what's happening at the school being aggregated into the school level score. So the elephant in the room is, I'm going to recognize it, I can't give you that exact score because we use those current year achievement scores to adjust the expected scores. And we don't have those until the end of the school year. So there is no exact expected scores at the beginning of the year. Could there be in the future? Once we have a few years of data, you could get some approximates. And that's what we're working towards, is collecting enough data about the relationship between the growth and the achievement within this new scale so that it can be communicated through a lookup table or some other kind of table in the future. So those flat lines in the prior slide, in order to really see where students are, we put them on a standard scale. So it's called a Z-score. And what that does is it tells us, how far are they away from how students are doing on average. And we actually do that across all the years so that the scores are comparable. And what you see in this picture is that here you have a group of lower performing students on the left. And over time, just within 1 year, you can see that they're spreading out, and then they're spreading out again, and then they're spreading out again. And every student has a slightly different trajectory. The same is true for students starting at the middle, and on the right-hand side, students starting at a higher point in the distribution. So we have to account for this if we're going to use this in a way that is more high stakes. So just a couple more examples just to kind of bring this home. Here's algebra students' score histories. Remember I mentioned that pretty much from 8th grade, the algebra and geometry scores go down. Well, here are the 7th graders, a sample of the 7th graders taking algebra. And you can see they start all over the place and they progress differently. But notice that in all, their distribution is slightly lower than what algebra students in 8th grade and 9th grade, the higher possible scale scores. Well, actually, I would say in 8th grade, but this is a really small number of students. So we take that into consideration in the model, which makes the score that they're expected to get more accurate and adjusted for what is the reality. And it's a great complement to what we are already learning from their scale score and achievement level that comes from the Atlas. Very quickly, I hope that these examples illustrate this. Here's an algebra student who was performing above average and did so in math coming up until they got into algebra. That's the score here in 2025. Notice this high-performing student went down in scale score, but because all of the algebra scores are a little bit lower, the expected growth is reasonable to how students are doing each year. So how did the student do in the past? And then what's reasonable this year? And that forms the trajectory. So you can do a trajectory for your students based on their prior Z-scores. And hopefully those will get shared in an updated version of LEA Insights. But this is why it's so vital that we have that current year score to adjust the expectation. There's just too much error if we're only projecting. If we were only projecting, we would have projected this student to be way up here, and that just isn't a place that they could have scored. One more student, if you've held on this long, you'll see that this student actually had two really high math scores, or not high, but they were pretty much on average back when they were taking the test in math. And then in 2024, they really dropped. And that expected score is if we had assumed that this student had been a lower performing student all along, we would not have expected the growth out of the student that we're expecting, which is really important because sometimes kids have a bad year. We don't want their entire expectation to be based on a single year. We want it to be based on as much data as we can so that we're actually fairly expecting a certain performance from that student. And that's what's illustrated here. You can see the student was kind of flat and then all of a sudden dropped. So their expectation, while not all the way up, it did not go down as you might have expected if we hadn't used this type of model. Year-to-year growth, very specific value-added system. Pros and cons to it. We're trading off exact destination or scale score for the fairness aspect of it, which is super important in many of our schools. So how then do you plan for growth throughout the year to impact growth from year to year? And this comes from understanding and using the system as it was designed to be used. And in this case, the Atlas system is bigger than one summative assessment. It was designed to help teachers and students recognize student learning throughout the year using interim and classroom assessments in addition to formative work that teachers may be doing locally through their HQIM. It's designed to evaluate student learning at the end of the year, but more to be a systems check of all students and our alignment with the expectations of the standards. It is designed to provide tools for teachers and students to inform where they're strong or on track or struggling. And finally, it's designed to provide tools and students to inform where instruction is aligned to the cognitive rigor required for proficiency at grade level and beyond. So if we're using this system as intended, then we should be able to gauge progress during the year, and that should impact progress from year to year or growth from year to year. In part 2, we're going to talk about how do you plan for within-year growth and what are some of the strategies you can use to make sure students are growing appropriately during the year to make the most of the opportunity they have to learn while they're with you. If you have a question that you want us to address in future FAQs, then just email us at oep@uark.edu and we'll be happy to do what we can.